What's up, everybody? It's Kevin here from Happy Beard Games, and today we've got a stack of video game goodness. These are all Stallone games. Stallone games? Yeah, video games based upon the movies of Sylvester Stallone. These games range from action games to racing games to boxing games, shooting games, and more. So there's a lot of variety here. In today's video, we're going to take a brief look at these video games. There are over 10 different Stallone video games in this video. Each one we're going to look at the basics real briefly. What is the game like? What is the controls like? The graphics, the sound, the style, and some of the highlights of each of the games, plus some of their negative side. Alright, let's jump in with Stallone games today on Happy Beard Games. Starting out with a big one here, one of Sylvester Stallone's most iconic characters, John Rambo from the First Blood and Rambo series. We've got a game based on the second Rambo movie, simply titled Rambo for the Nintendo NES. This is an action game, a side-scrolling game with some slight RPG elements, and is heavily inspired by the gameplay of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Whoa. There are many different Rambo video games out there, including a more recent arcade game. But the Rambo game we're looking at today was released in 1988 in North America for the Nintendo NES console, released in 87 in Japan for the Famicom. This game is simply titled Rambo. The game is actually based on the movie Rambo First Blood Part 2, which is a sequel to the movie First Blood, the very first Rambo movie. So it's a little bit misleading and a little bit confusing with the titles, because it's just called Rambo, but it is a basic story that's based upon the movie. And it's notable to point out that a lot of these movies that Sylvester Stallone is in from these movie-based games are R-rated movies. And Nintendo, of course, had strict censorship policies in the 80s and early 90s with their video games, so it's interesting that they still had an R-rated movie game put on the Nintendo NES. But the game Rambo is not a straightforward run-and-gun shooter as with Contra. This game is actually much more closer to the gameplay of The Legend of Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. All of the gameplay in Rambo is heavily based off the Nintendo game Zelda 2, and while Zelda 2 is a very different Zelda game compared to the rest of its series that remains true to this day, the game Rambo features a very close gameplay style. Following up with another Rambo title, we've got Rambo 3 for the Sega Genesis. This is an action shooting game with some light gun style, arcadey style shooter sequences mixed in with action over-the-top gameplay. It's fun. Now with Rambo 3, it was published and developed by Sega for all home consoles, so it never appeared on a Nintendo console, and it never appeared on things like the Super Nintendo, the NES, or the Game Boy. However, it did appear on the Sega Genesis, a 16-bit console from Sega, and the earlier Sega Master System in two different versions of the game. Rambo 3 for the Sega Genesis, it features over-the-head gameplay graphic style, where you're walking around a map full of enemies and shooting them as the character John Rambo. The levels at the start of the game are quite short, and the second level of the game is interesting because it changes up the gameplay. You now have a shooter type level that is a light gun style shooter, where you have a crosshair and you're aiming at a target and pointing and clicking to shoot. This is similar in ways to the Master System version, the earlier Sega console, which used the light phaser accessory. The light phaser accessory from Sega is similar to the Nintendo NES Zapper or light gun arcade games, where you point the gun controller at the screen to play the video game. And that means that the gameplay on the Master System version was much different than the Sega Mega Drive and Sega Genesis game that we have here today. And as it's on the next-gen Sega Genesis console compared to the Nintendo NES, this game features much better graphics than the Rambo game. But even with the better graphics and the changed-up gameplay style compared to the NES Rambo, personally I prefer the NES Rambo. Coming up next is one of my favorite video games on this list, and that is Judge Dredd for the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. For this video, the gameplay is very similar on each game, so we'll be doing a lot of side-by-side comparisons with the sound, graphics, and other qualities of the games. In Judge Dredd, you play as Stallone's character, Judge Dredd, who is the judge, jury, and executioner in the sci-fi post-apocalyptic future of this world. And remember, I am the law. The movie was based upon the comic book series Judge Dredd. So it features the style and themes of the movie, going level after level, progressing through the story of the movie. It's not so much based on the comics, but just the movie's story and plot as well. The video game Judge Dredd is a 2D action side-scrolling game with lots of shooting elements. You have guns, multiple types of ammo to use. It's similar in ways to the game Super Star Wars, as well as the game Alien 3, the Super Nintendo version that is. It features a dark atmospheric theme, going through dark cities with neon lights. You go through a sewer in a few levels, a prison area, and then you're out into a post-apocalyptic wasteland similar to things like Fist of the North Star or Mad Max. The game's story, much like the movie, takes place in the 22nd century. Everyone lives in cities where the entire world is turned into a desert dust bowl. The game Judge Dredd for Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis today are both very similar games on each console, so if you buy them on either one, you're getting pretty much the same experience. However, personally, I prefer the Super Nintendo version. Not just because I played it first and played it more than the Genesis version. When I finally compared them side by side for this video, I noticed almost immediately that the Genesis version had different graphic style and a different sound quality. Now, it's up to your own personal preference on the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, which console you like more, which style of games you like more. The Genesis has that twang sound for its soundtrack and effects. That's all intact in the Judge Dredd game for Genesis, but it's much different in Super Nintendo. It sounds more real, orchestrated-ish, almost CD quality in the Super Nintendo version. And the Genesis version definitely has its own style. Both the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis versions of this game, Judge Dredd, have very good graphics. I think they look great even for a movie-based video game. They just look great, and they resemble the characters, setting, and themes of the game based on the movie very well. However, I did notice that the Genesis version has slightly lesser graphics, and it's not just a side-by-side preference. There are actually objects in the background of the game that are just absent in the Genesis version. Things like signs, buildings, lights, and effects are just not there in the Genesis version. And the main reason that I like the Super Nintendo version more than the Genesis is because of the controller. The controls feel great on Super Nintendo. The controls actually have a use for each button on the controller, and after playing the Super Nintendo version for so long, when I switch over to the Genesis version, it feels like there's just not enough buttons to complete the gameplay. So on the Genesis version, I'd find myself actually using a special weapon that is limited when I only meant to switch over to that weapon and just select it. It kind of got in the way of gameplay because there was a limited amount of buttons on that controller. And remember, the Super Nintendo controller has over twice as many buttons as the basic Sega Genesis controller. Thankfully, the gameplay remains the same, and the gameplay is actually quite good. In fact, the movie was actually panned by critics, but the video game got mostly positive reviews, and I'm giving it a positive review as well, even though I actually did really like the movie, and that's what got me to buy the game in the first place. And so without reading a comic book and just seeing the movie, I actually really liked the movie. I thought Stallone was great as the main character. He looked cool, he acted it well enough. I don't know if it's close to the comic or not, but it didn't matter because the movie was entertaining to me. It features Rob Schneider as well as a sidekick character and comic relief. I don't really like Rob Schneider in every movie that he's in, but in this movie, he seemed to work well. The movie also featured one of my favorite songs by the rock band The Cure, one of my favorite bands as well, as the credits theme, so I really loved the song at the end of this movie. But back to the video game, you play as Judge Dredd, the judge, jury, and executioner in this new form of the law system. The gameplay is solid, fun, and feels great. It has a nice sense of gameplay objectives in this. You have two objectives that are very clearly laid out on each level. You have to either arrest them, or you can kill them. And in each level there is also a secondary objective that must be completed to exit the stage. These secondary mission objectives include things like locking doors, as well as destroying certain crates. And these crates you have to destroy with a certain type of ammo that you pick up throughout the level. There's multiple different ammo types you can use to help you fight your way through this game. And yes, there are big boss battles as well. It does hold up pretty well in the Genesis, so I'm not knocking that one too much. It's pretty much the same game on the Sega Genesis version, just slightly more limited. That's it for the Sega games today. We're moving on with some more Super Nintendo goodness with Cliffhanger. Cliffhanger is a game that features multiple different gameplay modes. The main gameplay mode is heavily inspired by beat-em-ups like Double Dragon. It also features escape modes where you're escaping and running from an avalanche, as well as rock climbing sequences, hence the name Cliffhanger, which is based on the movie of the same name. Cliffhanger was a movie and a video game that was released in 1993. It features Sylvester Stallone as the main character, Gabe Walker, who is a forest park ranger. Stallone's character is very good at rock climbing, and that leads into the title of the movie, Cliffhanger. It all takes place on mountains and in forests, as well as the video game following that same setting as well. The basic story of the movie is about a plane of terrorists that attempt to steal money from a treasury plane while airborne. It gets shot down by the FBI. The terrorists survive the plane crash, send out a distress signal, which Gabe finds out about. When Gabe goes to investigate that Mayday signal, he finds out it's coming from the group of terrorists. After reaching them, they capture his partner, hold him hostage. Then he has to set out and get the money and save his friend. There are basically three types of main gameplay in the game Cliffhanger. There's a basic Double Dragon beat-em-up style gameplay, which is a majority of the game. You're just beating up enemies, enemy terrorists, and just beating them up as they come on one after another, Double Dragon style, which is fun. It's fun to play as Stallone in a Double Dragon type beat-em-up. It's not the best gameplay mechanics for a beat-em-up. It's nowhere near as good as Streets of Rage, or even Double Dragon, or Battletoads, or anything like that. It's a little more limited, a little stiff, a little hard to control at times, but it does the job alright for a movie game. The game's graphics are pretty average for movie-based games in the early 90s on the Super Nintendo. Another gameplay style this game uses is rock climbing, which ties into the title and the theme of the movie, Cliffhanger. You are climbing up walls on a rock surface of a mountain. On these parts of the game where you're climbing straight up, you have to dodge enemy terrorists' bullets as they shoot at you from above on different platforms. This part of the game is pretty tricky and a very different style than the beat-em-up part, so you might end up losing a lot of lives at this part of the game. It takes a while to dodge the bullets, and if you get hit more than once, you'll fall off the edge of the cliff as you lose your balance and grip. And the third type of gameplay in the game Cliffhanger is an escape type stage. You have an avalanche of snow rushing after you, and you have to run and jump over different logs and rocks in order to make your way safely to the bottom of the hill after the avalanche. And at the very end of the hill, there's a gap you have to jump over, which is very tricky to land. And once you get past that, it's on to some more beat-em-up stages. Now, some of these beat-em-up stages have a little bit of platforming in them as well, so you do have to jump. And some of the jumping can be very tricky. There's a part where you have to jump on floating logs that come off a waterfall. That part gave me such a hard time. It was not so much fun. This is probably one of the weakest Stallone games that is on this video. Ultimately, I do not want to play this one again, but it was fun to check out. I do like the movie as well. So you know my opinions on the game, but what did other people say about this game back in the day? In Electronic Gaming Monthly magazine, they actually awarded this game the worst movie game of 1994. We've got one more game on the Super Nintendo, that is Demolition Man, based upon the movie of the same name which starred Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes. This game is an action side-scrolling shooter game. It also features some top-down shooter elements as well, so the gameplay changes it up from level to level, which I really like. Demolition Man was released in 1995. Today we're looking at the Super Nintendo version specifically. The game Demolition Man for Super Nintendo is an amazing experience. It's a lot of fun, it provides a real challenge, it offers at least two different types of gameplay modes. One of them is a 2D side-scrolling action game with a lot of shooting elements, where you play as the character John Spartan from the movie Demolition Man, who was played by Sylvester Stallone in that movie. John Spartan tries to defeat his nemesis, Simon Phoenix, who was played by Wesley Snipes in the movie. The game Demolition Man features what's called parallaxing graphics and level design. These layers of levels and graphics over each other can kind of lead to a more realistic setting in terms of 2D gameplay. This was also used on games like Earthworm Jim to make the games feel more 3D and have more depth to the gameplay in terms of how you're moving around the screen. The game also features some levels that are top-down shooter segments, similar to that Rambo III game in a way. And the other mode switches the camera perspective to an overhead perspective of the character, and it changes the way the graphics are displayed and the way everything looks, and it changes up the gameplay as well. But no matter the gameplay type, every level I've played in Demolition Man has so far been awesome. And it was kind of like a breath of fresh air going back and forth between the two gameplay styles. It was like having two games in one. And when I play this game Demolition Man, it reminds me of some of the new modern indie games that are two-dimensional action games that kind of feel a little bit similar to this gameplay. And this is where some of that gameplay style originated back in 1995.